Hey everybody, I am Hunter Bryn. I'm the Digital Media Specialist, and with me today I have Jonathan Page.
That's my name.
Who is a General Conference Delegate. And so General Conference is a thing that happens in the United Methodist Church. I grew up in the church, and I've never been, and I know very little about it. But as working through the conference office, we've been shooting these theme videos, which are all online at the moment. I think there's 5 or 6 of them talking about the general themes that are going to be happening at General Conference. And then what you haven't seen yet and is coming down the pipeline is about 15 or 16 legislative podcasts that talk about some of the different legislations, and we talk with other delegates about what is going to be happening at General Conference. Right. Well, I've spent the majority of the time, all of the time,
You've been behind the camera.
Behind the camera. And so I've been hearing different things like acronyms and different legislative things. And it's brought up a lot of questions. I mean, I grew up Methodist. I feel like I should know this stuff.
Sure.
But so the purpose of this video and podcast is mostly to bring to light or to answer some of the questions for myself personally, and also maybe some people who have been Methodist or just starting to become Methodist who've never heard of General Conference and don't really understand what that is. So I brought a delegate.
That's me.
Whose office is down the hall from mine.
It's true. It's very close. And I just celebrate this because I think a lot of times one of the things that I've experienced in the United Methodist Church from time to time is there's this assumption that like everybody just kind of knows what's going on, and when you don't know anything, and not that people don't know anything, right? I trust you all know things, but it's more. We want to be able to say like, hey, rather than just assuming everybody knows what's going on, let's talk about some of the basics of what happens at General Conference and what's going on. So thank you for coordinating this.
So my first question is pretty basic. I kind of know the answer to this one, but for everyone at home, what's the difference between an annual conference and a general conference?
Great question. So that's a part of our United Methodist polity. So an annual conference, it's already in its name, annual conference. It happens once a year. And annual conferences happen all around the world. We're divided into annual conference based on geography. So we are a part of the Virginia Annual Conference. A fun fact about the Virginia Annual Conference is we encompass more than one state. There's one United Methodist Church in Knott's Island, North Carolina, that's part of the Virginia Annual Conference.
I didn't know that.
Well, there you go. See, we're already doing the work.
Learn it.
But actually not the entirety of the state of Virginia is in our annual conference. So there's kind of west of about Blacksburg, Virginia. Those sort of what I would call the tail of Virginia is part of the Holston Annual Conference. But largely annual conferences comprise a state or multiple states. Just south of us in North Carolina, there's the Western North Carolina and the North Carolina Annual Conference. So sometimes there's 2 in one state. Anyways, those are geographic, and it's largely that's the place where you do mission and ministry. It's you come together once a year in annual conference session, but then throughout the year you're working together in collaboration to do mission and ministry with your local church and other local churches in that area. General Conference is really the legislative body of the church. So General Conference is made up of delegates from all around the world, the United States, Africa, Europe, the Philippines, all over the world. And they come together to essentially they're trying to accomplish a couple things. One is every 4 years. By the way, that happens once every 4 years. I should mention that.
Quadrennium.
Quadrennium. Yes, that is a term that is used. So once a quadrennium, they come together, and their work is around something called the Book of Discipline. So the Book of Discipline is a resource that is developed within the United Methodist Church. It's sort of our guidebook of how we want to live our life in community together. So it has a constitution. It's kind of similar to some of our American political documents. Like there's a constitution, we have theological standards, we have doctrinal standards, and then we have practices that we want to engage in together. And so that General Conference helps us to shape what we want that to look like for the next 4 years that are going to follow. It's also where we pass denominational budgets. So we have these boards and agencies that are a part of the United Methodist Church. Things like we have a General Council on Finance and Administration. We have a General Board of Communication communications. We've got a board of discipleship. You'll recognize some of these because in a lot of local churches, we would have like a finance committee and maybe a communications team or a discipleship team or something like that. So we have that for the general church too. And we've got to figure out how we want to allocate our money and be able to be good stewards of that. So that's part of the general conference as well. And it's like anytime the place where annual conference and general conference are similar is it's meant to be holy conferencing. So it's time where you have worship, you have folks who are building relationships together, and ultimately both of those bodies are looking to support the work of the local church. We have this statement in our Book of Discipline, the mission statement of the United Methodist Church is that we would make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. But then there's this second sentence that follows it that says local churches and extension ministries are the most effective arena through which disciple making takes place. So in their two very different contexts, very different purposes, but both are really looking to how can we resource the local church to be that arena through which disciple making takes place.
Now you said that there's an event that happens every 4 years.
Yeah.
And it's 2 weeks.
Yeah, right. So
I just booked my hotel room for the last week.
Right. So annual conference is often just a couple of days when the annual conference session is in place. General conference, it's I believe we're there for 12 days in total, April 23rd through May 3rd. So whatever the math is. I'm a pastor, not a mathematician.
So what's the general structure of, let's say, okay, you get to Charlotte. What the dates are?
April 23rd through May 3rd. So Tuesday.
So you get there on a Tuesday. What are you doing for the first week? What are you doing for the second week?
Sure. So there's a balance of time at General Conference between what are called plenary sessions and legislative sessions.
Define plenary.
Thank you. So a plenary is a large group gathering, not exclusive to the church, by the way. You may have plenary gatherings if you have like a company meeting or something like that.
Can I have a plenary in my living room?
If you had a plenary in your living room, you would have a very crowded living room, I believe.
Okay, so it's a
larger group of people.
Right,
yeah.
continue.
So at plenary, that's where worship happens. You'll have preaching in that space. That's also plenary will at times deal with legislation. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Early in general conference, it's probably going to be focused largely on worship, on gathering folks together, and it can be a part of a business meeting. We have plenary at annual conference sessions too. And if you've been to annual conference before, you know that like at any time somebody can have like a point of order or different things can come up where somebody wants to say, hey, can we do this together right now or something like that. And that can happen in plenary too at general conference. What typically happens though is following that kind of holy conferencing worship gathering, we then break up into our legislative committees. So I believe there are 14 legislative committees that are a part of this year's general conference. Mine is called Church and Society 3. It's the third of 3 that are related to church and society. And this governs all sorts of different areas of the Book of Discipline and Book of Resolutions. And so those legislative committees meet once a day in that first week. So I believe they start meeting on Wednesday. They'll meet Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And so that's where a bulk of the legislative work is going to take place. So there are, I believe, thousands of petitions that are before the general conference. And so rather, if you had, there are also 862 delegates in total that are attending this event. So if you had, I would just imagine for a second, if you had 800 people trying to decide, okay, well, can we put a "the" in that sentence or something? Like it gets a little tenuous. So we break into these smaller groups to be able to really do detailed work with legislation. And then within those groups, if there's massive agreement that something should happen or shouldn't happen, it's brought to the plenary session on something called a consent calendar, which means we're basically saying, hey, we all get with this, and y'all are probably all going to get with this too, or this is really not worth your time. We're going to, and so the consent calendar becomes part of our daily plenary session after that first day of legislative committee. And that just means, hey, we're saying we're going to, by approving the consent calendar, we're dealing with all of that legislation at once without anybody at plenary having to speak to it. We're trusting the work of our legislative committee. There will be some things that legislative committees deal with where there's not as much consensus. And they may say, hey, we actually need to talk about this as a big group. Also, there may be people like Hunter might say, if he were a general conference delegate, he'd be like, hey, I saw on the consent calendar that my resolution about videographers getting a mandatory 300% raise every year did not it didn't pass the legislative committee. I think we should talk about that in plenary.
Yeah, we should.
You can get a group of people together. By the way, that's a fake piece of legislation. It doesn't exist. Sorry, bro.
Could I gather a plenary of people?
Well, what you could do is you would gather a group of, I believe the standard is 20 people who sign a piece of paper saying, hey, we want this pulled off of the consent calendar. And then it comes off and it becomes part of the agenda for the day. And we talk about that piece of legislation. So anyways, so we do that the first week, those legislative committees, we do the consent calendars. And then on Saturday night, legislative committees finish their work. So you go as deep into the night as you need to on Saturday night to get that done. I've heard, I'm a first-time delegate. I've heard some stories about that. It's considered a real accomplishment if you can finish your work by dinner that night, but people go late into the night. Sunday of General Conference is set in our schedule as a Sabbath day. So we give delegates a minute to catch their breath, take a pause, do what they need to do, probably go to church. It seems like a decent idea. And then on Monday, we come back and we get back to work. And starting on the second week, that Monday of that second week, it is all plenary all the time. But that plenary becomes complete. It is both worship, preaching, discipling, all that sort of thing, and it's business at the same time. So you're dealing with all those petitions that either a legislative committee said, hey, we've got to talk about this as a larger group, or that have been pulled off the consent calendar and are needing to be dealt with as a whole.
So let's say I'm sitting at home, I'm on my couch, I'm kind of watching and paying attention. What week, if I'm just like a lady sitting at home, should I be really kind of paying a whole lot of attention to? Like, I guess in terms of voting, if you're going to put voting on the scale, is it more heavy first week, more heavy second week?
So you will, what I would imagine is you're going to, as the schedule sits right now, the plenary, like where you'll see like a broadcast of people like debating things on a floor and voting, that's mostly going to be on the second week. But there's a really two important caveats I would make with that. In our current schedule as it sits, there is a plenary session every morning of General Conference. So there's a possibility, and by the way, it's being held in Charlotte. It's all Eastern time morning. So if you're watching this from Tokyo or something like that, it may not be morning for you.
Pay attention to those world
pay
clocks.
attention to the Eastern Standard Time stuff. But no, the morning sessions, there will be some things to vote on. That would be one thing. In that first week, the second week, all plenary all the time. So you'll have maybe more of an opportunity to see votes happening on the floor. Something that can happen though when you're at the beginning of General Conference, the agenda has to be approved by the body. And so I would imagine that you may have some folks who want to amend the agenda. And in that case, everything could be thrown for a loop. And you could all of a sudden say, no, we need to work out these. Like somebody might get up and say, I think before we do any legislative committee work, we need to have these three things happen. And if the General Conference agrees to it and it's within the rules, okay, then that'll happen first instead. So that's the caveat. The second week is set up to be more of that sort of plenary week and a lot of that going on, but things can shift as we go along.
And as a communications person and as a communications office, our job during the week of a General Conference is going to be keeping people updated. If, like me or Maddie or Sam see that something
Who are those people, by the way?
They're all communications people who are at the Virginia Conference.
That's right, our staff.
So me and Maddie are going, but we're not going to the second week. But if, like, for say the first week happens and something gets pushed, we will let people know on Facebook, social media. If it's important, we'll let you know.
Absolutely.
But just so people do know, so you said it's in Charlotte. My favorite place in the world. I grew up in North Carolina. I was not thrilled.
You don't like Charlotte.
How did they decide that Charlotte, North Carolina is where they're going to have this global event?
So what's interesting, an important point of information about this particular General Conference is this is actually the 2020 General Conference.
Which is happening confusing.
In 2024. Yes, it is. So we're recording this on March 8th. I believe it might have been March. I don't know. It was sometime in 2020. It was about this time when you may remember this COVID thing that took place, and so the whole world kind of shut down, and it was announced the General Conference was going to be postponed. Originally, this conference was supposed to happen in Minneapolis, Minnesota. to get to your question of how this is decided, there is a body that's elected called the Commission on the General Conference. And the Commission on the General Conference does a lot of that front work of things like setting the agenda, working through a lot of the process of what General Conference is going to look like. And that team also is one of the teams, or is the team, I should say, that decides on venue. That usually is decided a long way out. So we kind of know well into the future when a general conference is supposed to take place and where it's supposed to take place. So after the postponement of the 2020 general conference, which then it actually got postponed a couple other times after that, it became sort of a narrow piece of time, narrow window to be able to figure out, well, where can we actually have this? Minneapolis, the first priority was given to them, but they no longer could host us due to some other scheduling things. And so it just became a really, my understanding at least, is it became sort of, okay, where could we do this? And Charlotte emerged as a place that has some factors in this are like, you have to have an international airport because we have folks who are flying in from all over the world. You've got to have adequate hotel resources, adequate, like a convention center or something like that to be able to, and so typically we're having these in larger cities. General conferences also historically have only happened in the United States since the founding of the United Methodist Church in 1968. It's interesting, there actually was a provision to do some general conferences around the world in 2024 and 2028. I believe it was going to be Kenya and the Philippines, and that got scratched in all of this. So anyways, that's a little bit behind that.
Another thing we get to say, thanks, COVID.
Yeah.
Cool. So my next question, let's do speed round. I'm
Okay.
going to give you some acronyms.
Some speed rounds.
You just give me what they
Okay.
mean. UMC.
United Methodist Church.
GC.
General Conference.
ADCA.
Advanced Daily Christian Advocate.
What is that?
Okay. So I like how we stop at that one. So the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate is a document that's given to delegates before General Conference takes place. That's where you get the advance from. And it's where all of the petitions are written for General Conference to consider. So there are a total of 3 volumes of the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate. It's about 1,540 pages in length, I believe. All told, it might be a little bit longer than that. But it's broken down by every legislative committee. The other thing that's in there, every delegate who's attending has their information there. There's even there's a seating chart. So believe it or not, it's kind of like we're taking it back to second grade. Everybody is assigned seats in the plenary session. So and part of that is done. When I first saw that, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, can't I just sit where I want to? But the reason that you do that is if you say, hey, like if I saw that there was a piece of legislation that had been written by a delegate from the Congo Central Conference or something like that, I may want to say, I want to go find that person. And rather than having to search through a room of thousands of people, I can look on that seating chart and say, oh yeah, well that central conference is sitting in this general area. So if I go there, chances are I'm going to be able to find the person that I need. And so it's practical in nature to have that. But anyways, so that's all there. And the reason it's ADCA is then every day at General Conference, there is a DCA that is printed for that day. So that has updates and DCA, Daily Christian Advocate. And so that's then, that gives updates on it'll show, like we mentioned, the consent calendar earlier. It'll have the consent calendar for that day in it. It'll have the agenda for that day in it, and maybe a recap of the previous day in some ways. So that's a little bit about that.
So is there a way for anyone to get the ADCA, or is that for delegates?
Yeah, there is actually. If you were to go right now to resourceumc.org, I believe we'll check on that, make sure it's not a .com, and whatever the right address is, we'll put it at the bottom.
Yeah,
of
it's
the
definitely
screen.
org. I've been there
.org. So you can go right now actually and download it. Like I said, it's 3 volumes. The most recent volume was published in late January, which is it's all the legislation that was submitted after 2020, but submitted in time for this General Conference session. So that's all available right there. And then there's another website that I'd have to look up the name of it, but if you wanted to actually do like legislation tracking. So you can kind of see, hey, here's what's passed, here's what's on the consent calendar, all that sort of thing. That's available digitally. It does require a fee from folks. So I think it's a $50 fee if somebody wants to get in on that, but it shows you kind of in real time what's happening with legislation.
Yeah, I need to get one of those for the seating chart, so I know where all people
there you
are.
go. That's right.
Or
we can just tell you.
That's true. That's true as well. Well, so you're a delegate.
Yep.
What is a delegate, and how do you become one?
Okay, so that's actually almost the question kind of works together. So delegates are elected by their annual conference. So annual conferences, based on the size of the annual conference, are apportioned a certain number of delegates for each general conference. So we have 22 from the Virginia Annual Conference, 11 clergy and 11 lay, and they're elected by the annual conference. So how you become one is you have enough people in the annual conference who say, yeah, we think that person should go, and they do. So we the delegation that's attending this general conference was elected in 2019. And so what happens in those elections, we elect 11 clergy and 11 laity to go to general conference. Then we elect another 11 clergy and 11 laity to go to jurisdictional conference, which is, maybe we'll talk more about that in a second. And then we elect 10 clergy and 10 laity who are alternates to jurisdictional conference. So all told, you have 32 clergy and 32 laity. And so what happens is over time, you may see some shifts in that because people may not be able to attend anymore. A great example for us, the first elected clergy person in our delegation in 2019 was a guy named Tom Bryn. Tom Bryn then in 2022 was elected bishop. He's now serving as the bishop of the Florida Annual Conference, which means he can't be on our delegation anymore. We love him.
Nope.
Wish him well. Hi, Tom, if you're watching. Or Bishop Bryn, I should say. Sorry, my bad. But what that meant is everybody moves up a spot. So we do the order of election becomes kind of important. So for example, like for me, I was the last clergy elected to General Conference. Nice. Shout out for that. So then I became the 10th elected clergy person. What that meant is Lindsay Bainham Freeman was the second elected clergy person. So she's now the first, and that means she's the head of our delegation. Shout out to Lindsay. And what that meant is the first elected jurisdictional clergy delegate moved up and is now a general conference delegate as well. And so that's Jeff Mickle. Jeff is a retired district superintendent from the Virginia Annual Conference, and he's great. On the laity side, there's been even more shifts. We actually we had somebody from our delegation who passed away, Darlene Amon, so we're remembering her a lot right now. And then we have somebody who was elected from the laity side who's now on the clergy side, Josh Blakely, and a couple of other shifts have happened there that mean new folks come into that place. But that's probably way more than you're asking for. But that's
I mean, that's perfect.
That's kind of how it works.
So you kind of mentioned that we have 22. I was talking to a buddy who's in the Arizona conference, and he said they have 2.
Yeah, right.
So
right,
how do they decide how many delegates Virginia gets versus how many delegates maybe like somewhere in Africa?
Yeah, sure. So it's all based on population, right? Not like state population. If it were state population, we would have like a ton of people from like Texas and California or something like that. And we'd be kind of in the middle. It's about the number of United Methodists that you have, the number of churches you have. There's a formula that goes into it. So for those of you who wouldn't be aware, in the Virginia Annual Conference, we are one of, if not the largest annual conference in the entire connection. 22, it's the most delegates from any one single annual conference. I believe maybe it's the North Georgia. Yeah, I'm grasping at straws here, but there's one other annual conference that also has 22 people going. But most annual conferences have slightly smaller delegations. In total, the United States represents about 56% of the delegates that are attending. About a third of the delegates attending this general conference are from Africa. And so you have, in Africa, you have central conferences, and then you have annual conferences that are within those. So that's where that representation is. You also have a pretty decent number of folks coming from the Philippines. And then there's a smaller number of folks that are coming from different parts of Europe. But it's broken down based on kind of that formula of the number of members you have in United Methodist churches, the number of churches you have, and
so
all that sort of thing.
If let's say we have a first-time visitor watching and they became a member of the United Methodist Church, there's a chance that we could get more delegates that way.
Well,
or is there like a checks and balances to make sure we don't we Virginians don't take the
Right.
most
Yeah.
delegates.
Well, yeah. If we just started like stacking the deck, right, and saying like, okay, well, we need a bunch of people to be members so that we can have more people go to general conference. It's also probably not like the best marketing strategy there's ever been.
That's morally wrong.
Yeah. No. But it does impact things, but it impacts them a little bit in the future. So like right now, we actually already know that in 2028, what the anticipated delegate balance is going to be. There's been such a big shift in the United. So if you've been paying attention to the United Methodist Church, you know that we've had this disaffiliation thing that's been taking place. So we know that through disaffiliations in the United States, about a quarter of United Methodists left the church through disaffiliation. That's different in Virginia. It wasn't that many, but there are other parts of the United States where a lot more people left. And so we know that at the 2028 General Conference, that's going to be the first General Conference where African delegates are the majority of the General Conference population. So it's likely that whereas now in Virginia, because we didn't see as much impact from disaffiliation, we may not see a change in the number of delegates that we elect, but we know in the U.S. as a whole, we'll be electing far fewer. And that'll be based on kind of how those numbers play out. So it's all about the population.
And so our next election for delegates at our annual conference isn't this year.
It's not this year, yeah. So the delegation that's with us right now will, in theory, will certainly be there for the postponed 2020 General Conference. And then we'll see after that when the next delegate elections will happen. It could happen in 2025, probably more likely to happen in 2026. But that's a little bit speculative. And some of that will be based on what happens at this General Conference.
So we were recording a podcast earlier, so if you're listening or you're watching still, it'll come out soon. You'll see it.
Yeah.
We were with Beth Givens.
Yeah, right.
And so she talked about she's in the Judicial
Administration is her legislative committee.
Yes.
Yep.
And you're in Church and Society 3. She had made a comment about working together.
Yeah.
How often do delegations Well, I guess actually let me back up just a little bit.
Yeah,
how did you get Church and Society 3 and how did Beth get Judicial?
Yeah,
how do they
great question. So after the election in 2019, the delegation was called together for a meeting. Fun story, I couldn't make that meeting. And so at that meeting, based on the order of election, the 14 legislative committees are sort of up on a whiteboard. And you can kind of say, hey, my gift set is really like for somebody like me, I might say, I really have a deep understanding. I work for the annual conference office now. So if I were being elected today, I might say, hey, conferences might be a good place for me to serve. Yeah. All of our clergy probably have some interest in the local church legislative committee. That's a big place. But you might say, somebody I think of who's on our delegation is Rob Vaughn. Rob has worked intimately with the General Board of Church and Society for decades. Well, so Rob kind of can say, hey, I happen to know a lot about church and society. I might need to be on one of those 3 teams or something like that. Anyways, so then we almost do, it's kind of like a draft, like the NFL draft is coming
it's like
up.
Fantasy football.
Yeah, a little bit. And so in order of election, you kind of say, okay, well, these are all the gift sets. But in order of election, then you go up and you choose which legislative committee you want to be a part of. The thing that we sort of mandate for ourselves within the Virginia Conference is we want to have at least one Virginia representative on every legislative committee. So what that means is there can't be more than 2 Virginia representatives on any legislative committee. So if the first clergy person elected and the first lay person elected both choose, let's say, independent commissions as one of the legislative committees, that would have been a shock. But shout out to my IC people, you're great. Then nobody else could pick independent commissions in theory through that. So when we did that in 2019, A, I wasn't there, but B, I was the last elected clergy person, and so it snakes kind of clergy lay clergy lay. So I had the last pick, and Church and Society 3 was the one place where we didn't have any representation, so that became the committee that I would be serving on. But that's and I think other annual conferences may work differently with that. That's just kind of been historically what we've done in Virginia.
Now back to my other question. Right. Working together through these delegation groups, how does that work?
Yeah, so there are some outside. I shouldn't say outside. There are a few different groups within the United Methodist Church that care deeply about kind of how we can organize and be prepared to work together. So, like a lot of our delegates, I think it's okay to just kind of say it this way. A lot of our delegates in Virginia are either centrist or progressive in their ideology. And so there's a group of folks who are centrist and progressive around the United Methodist Church who have said, hey, well, we kind of want to identify who centrist and progressive leaders are so that we can talk together about legislation. So like I'm in a group in Church and Society 3. There are about 15 of us that have a monthly call where we work through our legislation, and we're talking about like, okay, well, what legislation is before us that we want to support? Is there anything that we say, yeah, we're not really into that? Or is there stuff where we're like, hey, we know we're going to need to edit this in some capacity? That's also, each legislative committee has a chair, a vice chair, and a secretary. And so we've done some work around, okay, so who do we think we might want to elevate to be people who could be in those roles in that space? So that's really the work of a legislative committee working together. The delegation, the Virginia Conference delegation, we also meet about once a month. We usually meet on a Saturday here at the Conference Center, and that's a way that we can kind of share, hey, here's what's happening in our legislative committee that we want to work through. It's a way of being able, so we're a pretty healthy mix of first-time delegates and seasoned delegates. So we have tips on like how to handle General Conference. There's a group, I've got a almost 3-year-old at home, so there's a group of us that are like parents of young kids that have worked together on like how are you gonna try to be a good parent while you're away, and most of us are committed to being failures at that. No, just kidding. But we'll yeah, I hope not too. But you know, that's a part of that work together. And then when we get to General Conference, ultimately the legislative committees aren't in the Book of Discipline. So like even though Church and Society 3, like we're dealing with a section of what are called the social principles, called the political community. So that's where most of our time will be spent. But ultimately, anything that we bring, we talked earlier about like the consent calendar and all that sort of thing, whether it's through the consent calendar or through plenary action, like we will propose something to the entire General Conference for them to either affirm, decline, or edit. And then whatever is affirmed, that's what goes in the Book of Discipline. But it's all as one whole together.
Yeah. So you brought up something that I want to ask. You said like centrist and progressive, obviously in this very politically charged kind of way our nation is with the presidential election, all this kind of stuff.
Of course.
How often is it within delegate groups do you find people who may lean a little bit left, a little bit right, have kind of like infighting and kind of like a stalemate over like, let's say, a petition?
Yeah, I can't speak outside of Virginia to that, and also because I'm on the Centrist and Progressive legislative group, we're on board together. In Virginia, most of our folks are centrist and progressive. When we did the election in 2019, there was a movement, I think, to really push for centrist and progressives to be elected, and so I found our delegation is very cooperative. We tend to be on the same page about things. One of my colleagues on Church and Society 3 is part of the Indiana annual conference. Excuse me. So he, this person is very openly progressive, very interested in LGBTQIA inclusion, some things like that. One of their lay delegates in the Indiana conference was this guy named John Lamperis, who is he has worked previously for this thing called the Institute on Religion and Democracy that's been openly critical of the United Methodist Church, of any degree of inclusion and that sort of thing. John Lamperis has written a lot about this, and he recently resigned because he's now a part of the Global Methodist Church. But my friend Dwayne and John were on a delegation together. Dwayne would say that they didn't always see eye to eye about things, and it was harder to do collaborative work in their preparation because you have people that are coming from different perspectives. Yeah. Now, what we hope is we're all United Methodists in this, right? So if somebody's not United Methodist, they should have removed themselves from a delegation. Yeah. So, since everybody's United Methodist, even if you don't have the same exact way of thinking. By the way, I don't think in the Virginia delegation that we have all the exact same way of thinking. But we often have similar thoughts, and we can work together through a lot of things.
Well, so if you go to, let's say, General Conference, you're going to be meeting with people from all over the world, different cultures, different perspectives. What happens if you get into one of your legislative committees and it is like you guys can't decide on whether it's a language, a line in resolution or petition? what happens then? Like, I know you said you guys work into the night. Is that because of a disagreement, or you just can't find that common ground?
Well, you do. So General Conference in its legislative space does follow something called Robert's Rules of Order, which is it's a provision that allows for things to get accomplished. So Robert's Rules of Order used in like political settings often. It's what we use on our annual conference when we're dealing with things, but it's also used at the General Conference space. So that it's not. I think of some of, like, when I was in high school, there were different forms of debate that you could do, and one of them was just sort of like everybody gets to postulate on their opinion, and you just kind of go on and on and on. In theory, when you're following Robert's Rules of Order, the reason that you do that is so that you can get through things together. So it does mean that you have to vote. Like, I know for me, when I was a pastor in the local church, I hated taking votes on things because it meant that you had winners and losers. I always said, like, well, let's build consensus. Let's all agree upon this. Well, when you've got 860 plus people from around the world coming together, the chances of every single person saying yes or no to something is kind of slim. Like in 2016, there was a piece of legislation that was simply about equating women and men, saying women and men are of equal value in the eyes of God, something like that. That did not pass by 100%. Now,
so it doesn't have to be unanimous.
Right. It doesn't have to be unanimous. There are things, I don't know if we want to get this deep into it, but there's a difference between something that's an amendment to the Book of Discipline and something that's an amendment to the United Methodist Constitution. Anything that's a constitutional amendment, normal amendments just require a majority vote. So like in legislative committee, a majority of the legislative committee needs to either support or decline it for it to go into its next place. At the plenary, majority support or decline, and it moves on from there. If it's a constitutional amendment, it requires two things. It's a 2/3 majority of General Conference delegates have to be in support of it for it to progress forward. And then 2/3 of the aggregate vote of United Methodists from all over the world have to support it. This is important because, like, one of the theme videos we talked about, or in one of the theme videos we talked about this idea of regionalization. That's a big theme that's coming before the General Conference. So regionalization is one of those. It's a constitutional amendment. So not only would 2/3 of the people in Charlotte have to agree to it, but then it would go before every single annual conference if it passes that. And a total of the people who vote in that, it has to be 2/3 of that would make it pass.
Nice. So we talk about all these things that you guys are reading, and I've heard petition, I've heard resolution. What is it exactly you guys are reading?
Okay, so two different. There are actually kind of three different things that end up coming in. Well, it's more than three, but we'll boil it down to three for this. So there are disciplinary petitions, non-disciplinary petitions, and resolutions. So a disciplinary petition, that's probably the most, like, buzzword thing. That's something that's going to change language in the Book of Discipline. So, they could be adding language, deleting language, editing language. That all comes in the form of a disciplinary petition. It relates to a paragraph in the Book of Discipline, one that exists or one that's being added. A non-disciplinary petition is something that will not go in the Book of Discipline but impacts the life of the church in that it's a mandate. So oftentimes non-disciplinary petitions are related to budgetary expenses. So something where, hey, we're going to fund this or we're going to support this, and it's going to be like by rule we will do this. A resolution. And how I would sort of simply define a resolution is that resolutions are our aspirations. It's who we hope to be as United Methodists. Resolutions span a wide variety of different topics, different geographies, and all of that sort of thing. And so resolutions are in and of themselves non-binding. What that means is, like, we're going to say, like, hey, the United Methodist Church supports this idea in general, but it's in general, so it means not every United Methodist is going to support it, and we can't force action on it. So, like in Church and Society 3, we have a couple of resolutions that are before us that would involve petitioning the United Nations about something. Well, so, like, when let's say we vote those in, the United Nations doesn't have to take our call, right?
Yeah,
like they could say like, who are these people? No, we don't want to pay attention to them. So we can't put that in the book of discipline because it involves a third party where we don't control their interaction. But we can say, hey, we really hope that the United Nations will do these things. Yeah. So that's kind of the general summary.
So who writes these resolutions, and can anyone like how do they get from wherever they come from to your desk?
There's a paragraph in the book of discipline about this. I believe it's paragraph 501. Don't quote me. Yeah, somebody, I was going to say don't quote me on that, but you're probably will quote me on that. So yes, any United Methodist individual, a border agency, a group can get together and write a petition or a resolution to the General Conference. There are some stipulations about it. It has to fall within certain parameters that are outlined in that paragraph. One of the big things is it has to be submitted, I believe it's 230 days before the convening date of General Conference. The reason why we do that is not so that we can have a bunch of outdated stuff in front of us. All of those petitions then have to be translated. So we have English speakers, we have Spanish speakers, we have French speakers, we have Korean speakers. Like there are 4 different languages that then has to be translated into. And when you start thinking about, like, again, almost 1,600 pages worth of this has to be translated. I was a Spanish major in college. It takes a couple of seconds to translate things. And so to make sure those are translated with accuracy, you have to have time, because you got folks who are, and by the way, that's not just from English to all those. You've got people from other parts of the world who are writing in different languages where you translate to English, all of that. So you just have to have time so that the delegates can then receive the materials in enough time to prepare, to learn, to read, and all of that.
So is there a way to weed out some of the, because I know we just had a lot of disaffiliations. I'm sure like these are petitions, resolutions going back to the 2019.
Yeah, right.
Like from the canceled one all the way up to now. So I'm sure there's definitely some resolutions in there that have been either people disaffiliated, or it like is kind of not in context anymore, or how do they weed out some of those? So that way you're not sitting here reading one from 2019. It's like, we need peanut butter jelly sandwiches for lunch every day at General Conference.
So you hope, so some of the stipulations in that paragraph in the Book of Discipline mean that there's a person who literally, like, her job is to read everything that comes through and to decide is it valid or not. Yeah, we could probably look her name up and put it on the bottom, and
we will.
An email address to be
it.
like, hey, thank you for, like, you
maybe
were
not
a
an
saint
email
of the
address.
church.
She's got enough to read.
That's true. That's fair.
But we'll say thank you down here.
Thank you to that person. I wish I actually just talked with her a couple weeks ago. Anyways, so there's that screening. Then that Commission on General Conference is also a place where there's a space, or excuse me, I may have just misspoken. There's another group. It's not just that one individual. There's another group that then checks her work and says, okay, so do we agree that these are valid, these are invalid? Is there anything that would need to shift about that? And yet, so to your point, Hunter, like the really unique thing about this particular General Conference is because it's postponed. So we actually, in my legislative committee, we only have 2 disciplinary petitions, and one of them is written by a guy who is disaffiliated. So what we try to do in advance, again through some of those networking things, is to say, hey, if you know that there's a person who disaffiliated, let's put their name up, and then you can kind of mark, and it's not that you mark it out. So like, I'm going to give you an example about that in a second. Not that you mark through that piece of legislation and say, well, don't consider it at all, but just be reminded, like, hey, this person's disaffiliated, so they're no longer invested in whether or not this is seen through. So a great example of this, there are a number of petitions in the Discipleship Legislative Committee that were written by a guy named Mark Webb. So you'll see Mark Webb all throughout it. But the way it's written is Mark Webb on behalf of the General Board of Discipleship. Well, who Mark Webb is. Mark Webb actually might be familiar to Virginia folks to some degree. Mark Webb is a United Methodist bishop, most recently who served in the upper New York area of the United Methodist Church. He preached an ordination service in the Virginia Annual Conference a few years ago, and he disaffiliated. He left the United Methodist Church. He's now a bishop in the Global Methodist Church. But all of the legislation that he put forth was on behalf of the Board of Discipleship. So if you just, like, I know when I first opened up the ADCA and I saw his name, I was like, well, forget that. I'm gonna knock all that out. Well, and then I realized, oh wait, that's on behalf of the board of discipleship, they actually really want that to come through, even though the person is not somebody who's any longer United Methodist. So that's an example of where that nuance is. So is there a way to weed through all of it? You're trusting that some of those folks have done their job, and the committees have done the work to take out the stuff that's really not relevant. If you know of a name where you're like, hey, just be cautious around this, that's the thing. But otherwise, you look at it all and you check it all out.
It's a lot of reading.
Yes, I would affirm that.
Thank you for doing that.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
So how does voting work? And I'll kind of let this be kind of our last because we're getting a little long. But how does voting work at General Conference? Yeah,
so again, we have the legislative committee space. So voting happens there. Those are smaller teams. Like on Church and Society 3, we don't even have 30 people on that. So you have devices. We sometimes have had those at annual conference. So you have a device that you say yes or no or whatever it may be, or if you want to speak, you can alert through that. So again, it happens through the legislative committee. Legislative committees put things on the consent calendar, or they become a part of the larger agenda. And then those votes happen in the plenary space too. And so if you're asking, it's like literally it's a voting device kind of thing, an electronic deal. The reason that becomes really important is it means you can kind of check in right from the get-go and say, hey, this person is an authorized person to vote. What you don't want to have happen, I love you, Hunter. I'm glad you're going to be there as a videographer, but you're not a delegate. So if I were like, hey, I got to go run to the toilet real quick, Hunter, can you sit in for me and pretend that you're Jonathan so you can vote for me? That's a huge no-no. We cannot do that. So, your voting device is then connected to a barcode that you have to scan on your person that says, hey, this is, or something. It may not be that that thing, but there's a way of connecting it so that the vote that's been cast has been cast by the person who was elected to take the vote in the first place, or to make the vote in the first place.
So I lied. One more question.
Yeah, good.
Why is it important for people to know what's going on at General Conference? How can some of the decisions being made at General Conference affect me if I'm sitting in a pew at a church?
Yeah.
A local church.
Well, ultimately, one of the things, I remember I said this when I attended the 2019 General Conference, which was kind of a lousy experience. That was it was really, really painful for a lot of folks from a lot of different perspectives. And I remember coming back, and I was pastoring a local church at the time, and a big thing that I told them was that the General Conference can legislate for the church, but it cannot be the church. I think it's important to remember that the legislating of the church impacts the activity of the church. So what that means is so for example, there's a huge budget cut that's being proposed in 2024 at General Conference. That is going to bleed in for the next 4 years to the apportionments that local church pay to be a part of the United Methodist Church as a part of our faithfulness and generosity. So I'd want to know if I were in the local church, hey, how's this going to impact how my contributions to the church are being stewarded? That's a piece of it. But on the large part, your colleagues at work, your neighbors in your neighborhood, the people that you're around. If you've said, hey, I attend XYZ United Methodist Church. Well, at the end of General Conference, my suspicion is there's going to be a few national media agencies there, international media agencies, that are going to say, hey, United Methodists had their once every 4-year meeting, and here's what they decided. You might want to be able to talk to your neighbors about that, or to your coworkers about that, to your family members about that, and to be able to say, hey, here's what I understand about what just took place. Here's why I support it. Maybe here's why I'm challenged by that, whatever it may be. And realize that as that then gets implemented, that can have some significance in the work of your local church. It can have, there's a few different things. For example, my legislative committee is working on the revision of the social principles. So that means we're going to have some different standards for how we treat one another in the life of the church. That's a big deal. And it's hopefully my prayer is that it'll be more reflective of how we're called to be in community together and that sort of thing. But in any case, it does have that potential to impact your day-to-day life in the local church. So I'd say it's worth your time and attention. It's worth investing in. And the good news is I don't want you may be about to say this as a spoiler alert, but like we have resources available at vaumc.org/GC2024, where like one of the big goals that we've said in our office is no matter what happens at General Conference, we hope that people who are paying attention, who are investing in these resources, will not be surprised by whatever outcomes come to play. And that for me is a big piece. It's just, can you be ready to address it however it comes down, and know that we're going to do our best to follow the will of the Holy Spirit, and we'll see how well we do at that. But being able to talk that through and know that in your personal space is important.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who's listening. If we have forgotten something, leave a question down below. We'll try to answer it in the comments. We have theme videos. Go back and watch those. He gave the website vaumc.org/GC2024, or is it just 24? We'll put it down 24. Here at the bottom.
2024. Yeah, that's right.
On our website, we've got resources. We got theme videos. We're coming out with a bunch of podcasts /videos /TikTok /Instagram Reels from all of our delegates talking about the legislation they're going to see. We hope that this was helpful for you, and congratulations to making it through a 50-minute video.
Woo!
Have a good day.
Thanks, Hunter.